We'll put the draft resolution to the vote. I request that those voting in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S-2022-155 to raise their hands.
Кто против?
Those against?
Кто воздержался?
Abstentions?
Результаты.
The result of the voting is as follows. 11 votes in favor, 1 vote against, 3 abstentions. The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Security Council. I now give the floor to those members of the Security Council who wish to deliver statements after the vote. The Russian Federation voted against the anti-Russian and anti-Ukrainian draft resolution of the Security Council that was submitted today. Why is it anti-Russian? I think that there is no need to explain. It suffices to have merely cast a cursory glance at the text. Why is it anti-Ukrainian? This is because the document, beyond any doubt, runs counter to the fundamental interest of the Ukrainian people insofar as it is an attempt to salvage and cement in Ukraine that system of power which brought the country to the point of tragedy, which has now been ongoing for at the very least 8 years now. We thank those who did not support this draft. I will not respond to those who just accuse the Russian Federation of abusing the veto right. Well, the main reason for our negative vote is not the fact that there is what is included in the draft, but what is left out. If its sponsors were to attempt to make it even remotely balanced, then they would not have left out issues which must be addressed and cannot be overlooked in the context of the Ukrainian problem. Specifically, they would not. What was left out is the fact that those who assumed and seized power as a result of the anti-constitutional coup in Kyiv in February 2014, I refer to the Maidan junta, the way that they unleashed a war against the residents of the country's east, shelling residential areas with artillery pieces and multiple rocket launchers, raining bombs on the people of Donetsk and Lugansk. What was left out was the way that the Ukrainian authorities, with the encouragement of their Western patrons, consistently and cynically shirked their responsibility to implement the Minsk agreements, the linchpin of which was direct dialogue with the residents of the country's east. At the same time, what was positioned on the line of contact, the deployment of Ukrainian death squads comprised largely of radical neo-Nazi battalions, methodically, day after day, shelled the residential areas of DPR and LPR, killing women, children, and the elderly. And incidentally, this is ongoing today. Just today, 4 civilians died as a result of the actions of the Ukrainian armed forces. And how can we fail to mention the blood-chilling crimes by the Ukrainian nationalists as perpetrated over the past 8 years? The fact that the protesters against Maidan in Odessa were burned alive. The fact that peaceful protesters in Maidan were shot at by unknown snipers. The investigation into both of these tragedies is something that has been deliberately swept under the rug by the Maidan regime. At the same time, the culprits in the Odessa tragedy are well known. They are openly flaunting their presence. And yet an alternative investigation and the recognition by the snipers themselves unambiguously confirms that the slaughter on the at Independence Square was a provocation by the leaders of Maidan. We specifically last year carried out an informal Security Council meeting, an ARIA formula meeting, on both of these issues with the aim of sharing with Security Council colleagues more information about this. And yet in response, at best, what we heard from Western partners were merely hackneyed cliches about so-called Russian propaganda. How can there be a resolution on the Ukrainian issue without these above-mentioned issues being mentioned? It would have been wise to include in the draft of an honest assessment of the role of Western colleagues in inflating this Ukrainian crisis. Not only did they stand behind the Maidan coup, but they also effectively issued a carte blanche to Kyiv to carry out any acts, any steps that would be unthinkable for any civilized state. And this includes the egregious discrimination against the Russian language and consequently Russian language speakers. This includes glorification of Hitler's henchmen aligned alongside the prohibition on processions to honor the real heroes of Ukraine who freed it of Nazism as well as the religious schism in that country. As you spin tales about the triumph of democracy in Ukraine, the Maidan authorities and nationalists have been, with impunity, murdering their political opponents. They have been persecuting the opposition. They have been shuttering opposition television channels where it was possible to at least have some small dose of relatively objective information. Six of those television channels were shuttered under President Zelensky alone. And how can we fail to mention the fact that Weapon has been flooded with weapons that were used then to kill civilians in Donbass. You have made Ukraine a pawn in your geopolitical game with no concern whatsoever about the interests of the Ukrainian people. Responsibility for what is transpiring at present lies not only with the Ukrainian government, but it also lies at your feet, ladies and gentlemen. And today's draft resolution, your draft resolution, is nothing other than yet another brutal, inhumane move in this Ukrainian chessboard. Colleagues, today, all Western media outlets have been inundated with reports about how civilian populations in Kyiv and a host of other Ukrainian cities have been seeking shelter in bomb shelters, and they are fighting for their lives and fleeing artillery fire. We are genuinely empathize with our neighbors, and we urge them not to yield to provocation. President Putin and the Russian Defense Ministry explicitly stated and clearly stated that there would be no strikes targeting civilian infrastructure, but nationalists are already using civilians as human shields. Specifically, we categorically condemn the placement by nationalists in residential areas of artillery and multiple rocket launchers. This is a direct breach of the norms of international humanitarian law, including Articles 51 and 58 to the first additional protocol of the Geneva Conventions. We see the way the situation is being exploited in propagandistic exercises by Western politicians and media outlets. I would like to ask you, where were you 8 years ago? Why were you unmoved when there was murder and artillery strikes in Donbass? Why didn't you even bother to notice that there are more than 4 million people living in DPR and in LPR who at best were branded pro-Russian separatists? Why didn't you repudiate Poroshenko when he said that the residents of Donbass would rot in basements? Or Zelensky, why didn't you repudiate him when they called them non-people and specimens? Parenthetically, I cannot but note that at the height of propaganda, our colleagues very frequently use imagery from Donbass, brandishing them as alleged consequences of the so-called Russian aggression in Ukraine. These kinds of fakes are abundant and proliferating today. They have flooded the internet and a number of Telegram channels. And there are videos of alleging Russian strikes targeting residential areas, which were filmed in other parts of the world and have nothing to do with Ukraine. This was mentioned today by the British Broadcasting Company, the BBC, having issued an article, Ukraine Conflict, Many Misleading Images Have Been Shared Online. Everything is there. There are photographs of parades, photographs of American aircraft which bombed Libya, and photographs from Syria, and even an explosion in Beirut, which is being portrayed as what is transpiring in Ukraine. I will send this article to you, distinguished members of the Security Council, separately. And specifically, I wish to turn to my French French, British, and American colleagues. The permanent representative of France said that in Ukraine, what is taking place is the murder of civilians. That is untrue. Russian troops are not bombing Ukrainian cities. And we said that they are not threatened by anything. There is no verifiable confirmation whatsoever about the deaths of civilians. The permanent representative of the United Kingdom, I would note that what you are portraying as alleging that Russian military pieces are targeting civilians. I saw the reports today, and I would like to report that you can see from the videos that this is a heavy tank piece, which is called Strela 10, Arrow 10. And this is in the possession of the Ukrainian armed forces. The Russian military does not have this kind of equipment. They are obsolete. This is the kind of fake pieces of information that you are using. Our U.S. colleagues, I would note that this, with respect to the alleged bombing of the kindergarten, that too is fake. Of course, it is difficult for us to compete with the United States in terms of the number of invasions targeting their neighbors. I will refrain from listing out the aggressions carried out by the United States in their history, but you are in no position to moralize. To conclude, I wish to emphasize, we are not waging a war against Ukraine or the Ukrainian people. We are carrying out a special operation against nationalists and for the protection of the residents of Donbass, for denazification and for demilitarization. These objectives will soon be achieved, and the Ukrainian people will gain an opportunity to once again independently determine their future, and in so doing to live in peace, good neighborliness, and cooperation with all of their neighbors.
Distinguished members of the Security Council, I will not dignify the Russian diabolical script that is rather a letter of application for an upscale seat in the hell by commenting it. I would like to use this opportunity to thank the parents of every ambassador here, to thank the people of the democratic nations who put these ambassadors in their seats, to tell the children of those ambassadors that they should be proud of their parents, that they have voted in favor of the resolution. I thank my good friend Nicolas from France, Rolando from Brazil, my good friend Hajar from Albania, Linda, Barbara, Mona, my good friend from Mexico, Martin from Kenya, Ireland, Ghana, Gabon. I thank dozens and dozens of co-sponsors who would vote in favor of their resolution should they have a chance to vote, but they will have this chance in days to come. The draft recalls the obligation of all states under Article 2 of the UN Charter to refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. The draft called on Russia to stop its offensive against Ukraine. And the memories are very fresh. The Security Council was discussing the ways to prevent the war quite recently in this very chamber. And at the very same moment, deadly airstrikes were dropped on civilian heads across my country. And the Russian troops crossed the Ukrainian border from the territory of Russia. The territory of Belarus was used for missile attacks, and the troops were marching from the occupied parts of the Ukraine's Donbass and Crimea. Last night was the most horrific for Kiev since, just imagine, 1941, when it was attacked by Nazis. Last night was attacked by someone who pretends they are fighting with neo-Nazism. Therefore, I'm not surprised that Russia voted against. Russia is keen on continuing its Nazi-style course of action. The Kremlin regime should not be called Russian regime. The Kremlin regime should be called Russist regime. A couple of hours ago, my president said, and I quote, "Tonight, the enemy will use all the forces at their disposal to break our resistance, vile, cruel, and inhuman. Tonight, they will storm. We must all understand what awaits us. We have to persevere tonight. The fate of Ukraine is being decided right now," end of quote. We just heard something that the Russian ambassador wanted to present as assurances from himself and from his leadership that it's all provocation. And that he urged us not to yield to provocations. Do you remember how many times he said that, and his deputies said in this very room that there will be no invasion, no attacks? Do you remember how, during the previous session, he was walking out of the chamber, trying to call someone, not knowing what was going on? How we can trust you? How we can trust your assurance? You have no idea what is on the mind of your president. Your words have less value than a hole in the New York pretzel. The Russian Federation that occupied by treachery the seat of the Security Council member in 1991 violates daily not only the Charter, but also the provisional rules of procedure of this Council. Because if Russia did not violate the provisional rules, then Mr. Nebenzia had to follow Article Rule 20. Let me quote. I begin the quote. "For the proper fulfillment of the responsibilities of the presidency, he should not preside over the Council during the consideration of a particular question with which the member he represents," that's the Russian Federation, "is directly connected. He," the rule reads, "shall indicate his decision to the Council not to preside." So since the Council is not ruled by the current presidency by rules, I will be probably also unruly. And I will ask all of you to dedicate a moment of complete silence to pray or to meditate if you do not believe in God, for peace, to pray for souls of those who has been already killed, for souls of those who may be killed. And I invite the Russian ambassador to pray for salvation. Please, ladies and gentlemen, let us spend a moment in a complete silence.
Прошу прощения, прежде
I do apologize, but before moving to a moment of silence, I want to include in the list those people who perished over all these years in Donbass. They also are worthy of being mentioned. All human lives are valuable. Let's not forget them either.
But let's, ladies and gentlemen, spend a moment in complete silence. Thank you. I thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Mr. President, India is deeply disturbed by the recent turn of developments in Ukraine. We urge that all efforts are made for the immediate cessation of violence and hostilities. No solution can ever be arrived at the cost of human lives. We are also deeply concerned about the welfare and security of the Indian community, including a large number of Indian students in Ukraine. The contemporary global order has been built on the UN Charter, international law, and respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. All member states need to honor these principles in finding a constructive way forward. Dialogue is the only answer to settling differences and disputes, however daunting that may appear at this moment. It is a matter of regret that the path of diplomacy was given up. We must return to it. For all these reasons, India has chosen to abstain on this resolution. I thank you.